Daniel Cross, haunted by war and financial ruin, enters Rose's pawn shop to sell his grandfather's silver star. The metal, etched with Henry Cross's name, stuns Rose, who vanishes, returning with a tear-streaked face and a photograph. She reveals Henry saved her life in 1944 Normandy, hiding her from German soldiers. As Daniel grapples with this hidden legacy, Rose offers an envelope of savings, insisting it's a debt repaid. What secret promise did Henry keep silent? Will Daniel reclaim his purpose through this unearthed past? The story teeters on revelations that could change everything. If this story moved you, join us in honoring hidden heroes. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true tales of courage. Share your family's untold stories in the comments with respect to keep their legacies alive. Support our channel, and let's remember those who sacrificed silently. The pawnshop's door creaked as Daniel Cross stepped inside, his boots scuffing against the worn floorboards, stirring up a faint cloud of dust that shimmered in the dim light. In his hands, he cradled a small velvet pouch, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. His fingers, rough from years of gripping rifles and climbing rocky hillsides, trembled slightly as he clutched it, as though letting go might unravel something deeper than he could bear. "I need the money," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper, carrying the kind of resignation that comes when pride has been worn down to its raw edges. The elderly shopkeeper, Rose Alcott, glanced up from her work, her eyes sharp behind glasses perched low on her nose. She took the pouch with a practiced gentleness, sliding the contents, a single silver medal, into her palm. As she turned it over and read the name etched into its surface, her face drained of color. Without a word, she retreated to the back of the shop, leaving Daniel alone with the ticking of antique clocks and the weight of his own thoughts. 10 minutes later, she returned, her hands clutching a faded black and white photograph, tears tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. "This man," she said, her voice trembling, with a reverence that caught Daniel off guard, "he saved my life during the war." Some stories, she seemed to say, weren't just memories, they were debts, promises carved into the fabric of time, waiting for the right moment to be honored. Daniel Cross, 33 years old, a former infantry soldier, stood in that pawn shop, feeling the world tilt beneath him. He hadn't shed a tear since Kandahar, not when the desert sun burned his skin raw, not when the Humvee carrying his best friend erupted into flames, not even at the funeral where he stood rigid, staring at a flag-draped coffin, wondering why he'd been spared. Not even when he returned home to Larchwood, a small town where the war hadn't stayed behind but had followed him, settling into his chest like a slab of concrete, heavy and unyielding. It pressed against his ribs at night, when the power flickered out and the nightmares crept in. Flashes of gunfire, the smell of burning rubber, the screams he could never quite silence. But that morning, as he sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, the velvet pouch in his hands, something inside him cracked. It wasn't just the 3 overdue bills stacked on his kitchen table, their red ink screaming urgency. It wasn't the refrigerator's empty hum, a mocking reminder of his dwindling options, or the landlord's final notice tucked under his coffee mug, its words sharp and final. It was the pouch itself, soft and worn, holding the silver star his grandfather, Henry Cross, had earned in World War II. That medal had once gleamed in Henry's desk drawer, a quiet testament to a war he rarely spoke of. Henry's stories were fragments, half-told tales of muddy trenches and distant gunfire, always cut short with a shake of his head and a sip of black coffee, as if words could never carry the weight of what he'd seen. But Daniel knew it mattered. You didn't wrap something in velvet unless it held a piece of your soul. Henry had been the one to teach him how to cast a fishing line, how to change a tire with steady hands, how to stand tall even when the world turned its back. Now, that medal was all Daniel had left of the man who'd been his anchor, and letting it go felt like betraying the only steady thing he'd ever known. The decision to sell it hadn't come easily. Daniel had sat for hours that morning, staring at the pouch, his mind wrestling with the necessity of survival against the ache of loss. Pride didn't pay the rent, didn't fill the fridge, didn't stop the letters from piling up. He'd zipped up his faded field jacket, its olive drab worn thin at the elbows, and stepped out into the drizzle that coated Larchwood's quiet streets. The town was small, its people polite but distant, offering nods instead of questions, as if they knew grief was a private thing, not to be disturbed. Daniel walked 3 blocks, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, to Rose's Relics, a narrow pawn shop squeezed between a shuttered barbershop and a tax service with a sign so faded it still advertised rates from 1989. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, and a wave of warm light spilled over him, illuminating rows of antique clocks, glass cases filled with war memorabilia, and shelves cluttered with forgotten instruments and tarnished silverware. The air smelled of wood polish and time, a scent that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop, where they'd carved duck decoys together, Henry's hands steady and sure. Behind the counter stood Rose, a woman in her early 70s, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes focused on a pocket watch she examined with the care of someone who understood the stories objects carried. "I'll be right with you," she said without looking up, her voice kind but firm. Daniel nodded, though she didn't see, and took a slow breath, wandering the shop's aisles. The silence was gentle, almost comforting, but it couldn't ease the knot in his chest. He reached into his pocket, feeling the pouch again, its softness a stark contrast to the hard edges of the metal inside. It felt heavier today, as if it knew what he was about to do. 6 months earlier, Daniel had filed a claim with the VA, his hands shaking as he typed out the truth. He couldn't hold down a jaw, couldn't sleep through the nights when the power went out and the darkness brought the war back to life. The response had been a letter, then another, each one a variation of processing. Delayed. Additional documentation required. He'd served 2 tours, carried the weight of his country's battles, and now he couldn't even get a call back from the hardware store where he'd applied for a stockroom job. The rejection stung, not because he wanted the bomb so badly, but because it reminded him how far he'd fallen from the man he had once been. Standing in Rose's shop, he stepped forward, the pouch clenched in his fist. "I need to sell something," he said, his voice soft but steady, though it carried the weight of everything he was letting go. Rose looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, she saw it. The flicker of a man holding on to the last thread of who he used to be. This wasn't just a sale, it was a surrender. Rose Alcott had seen plenty of desperation in her years behind the counter. People didn't walk into pawn shops to sell their joys. They came with burdens, heavy with regret and necessity. Wedding rings from marriages that had crumbled, guitars that once sang in smoky bars, watches engraved with names their owners wanted to forget. Each item carried a story, and Rose had learned to read the weight in people's eyes before they even spoke. But this man, Daniel, was different. There was a quiet dignity in his posture, a resilience that hadn't been fully broken, though it was fraying at the edges. When she opened the velvet pouch and saw the silver star, her breath caught. She turned it over, her fingers tracing the name, Henry Cross, and a memory long buried surged to the surface. Her hands began to shake, not from age, but from the flood of emotions that came with that name. She excused herself, retreating to the back room where she kept a small box of keepsakes, things too precious to display. There, among letters and trinkets, was the photograph, a grainy black and white image of a young soldier, his face serious but kind, standing beside her in a war-torn village. Henry Cross had saved her life, pulling her from the rubble of a bombed-out building, his voice calm even as chaos raged around them. She'd been a nurse then, barely 20, and he'd been a stranger who became her savior. Now, decades later, his grandson stood before her, ready to part with the one thing that tethered him to that legacy. The tears came unbidden, not just for the memory, but for the pain she saw in Daniel's eyes, the sacrifice he didn't want to make. Holding the photograph, she returned to him, her voice thick with emotion. "This man," she said, "he saved my life." And in that moment, the pawn shop became more than a place of transactions. It became a bridge between past promises and present struggles, a reminder that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. There was an air about him that set him apart, though she couldn't quite place it. Rose studied Daniel's hands as he stood across the counter, hands roughened by life, calloused from years of labor, yet trembling faintly, betraying a nervousness that seemed to hum beneath his calm exterior. He reached into his pocket with deliberate care, as if handling something fragile, something alive. From it, He drew a small navy velvet pouch, its fabric worn but soft, like a relic carrying secrets too heavy to speak aloud. His fingers hesitated, clutching it as though it might slip away or turn to dust if he moved too quickly. With a slow, reverent motion, he placed it on the glass countertop between them, the faint clink of the pouch against the surface breaking the quiet of the shop. "I'm not sure what it's worth," Daniel said, his voice low, tinged with uncertainty and something deeper, perhaps a longing to understand the weight of what he carried. His eyes, searching in earnest, lingered on the pouch, then flicked up to meet Rose's gaze, seeking answers she hadn't yet given. Rose didn't respond immediately. Her heart stirred with a quiet instinct, a pull she couldn't name. She reached for the pouch with both hands, her movements gentle, almost ceremonial, as if she were a priestess handling a sacred offering. The velvet was cool against her skin, and as she loosened the drawstring, she felt a tremor of anticipation ripple through her. She tilted the pouch, letting its contents slide into her palm. A small piece of silver gleamed there, dulled by time but radiant under the soft glow of the shop's counterlight. Its five-pointed shape was unmistakable, even without reading the inscription. A silver star, a medal for valor, earned in the crucible of enemy fire. Rose's breath caught, her chest tightening with a sudden rush of recognition. She had seen one only once before, encased in glass at a museum, a distant artifact of heroism. But this was different. This was real, heavy with history, pulsing with a story that seemed to demand her attention. She lifted the star slightly, turning it over with care. The engraving on the back came into view. H. Cross, 1944. Time seemed to pause. The air in the shop grew thick, pressing against her skin. Her spine stiffened, and her hands, steady just moments ago, began to shake under the weight of something far greater than the medal itself. It wasn't just the star, it was the name, the year, the flood of memories that surged unbidden, threatening to overwhelm her. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles whitening, as if holding on could anchor her against the tide of emotion. Daniel's voice broke through, tentative but concerned. "Is something wrong?" His brow furrowed, his eyes scanning her face for clues. He leaned forward slightly, his own unease mirrored in the way his fingers twitched at his sides, uncertain whether to reach out or stay still. Rose couldn't answer. Not yet. Her throat tightened, words trapped behind a wall of feeling she hadn't prepared for. "Excuse me a moment," she whispered, her voice barely audible, fragile as a thread about to snap. Without waiting for a response, she turned abruptly, clutching the star to her chest as if it were a piece of her own heart. She moved quickly, too quickly for a woman of her years, through the swinging wooden door at the back of the shop, the little bell above it jangling faintly as she passed. The door swung shut behind her, leaving Daniel alone in the stillness. He stood there, rooted to the spot, the silence of the shop wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. His mind raced, replaying the moment. Had she thought the medal was stolen? Was there something wrong with the name? He hadn't done anything wrong, he was sure of it. The star had been in his family for decades, tucked away in a drawer, wrapped in that same velvet pouch, untouched and unspoken of. His grandfather, Henry, had never worn it, never boasted of it. It had simply existed, a quiet relic of a past Daniel barely understood, like a ghost that lingered in the shadows of his family's history. And yet, the way Rose had reacted, her sharp intake of breath, the way her hands trembled, felt like a lightning strike, sudden and electric, illuminating something he couldn't yet see. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around the shop. The shelves were lined with antiques, clocks that no longer ticked, porcelain figurines gathering dust, faded photographs in ornate frames. The air smelled of old wood and memories, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet only deepened his unease. He could hear sounds from behind the wall, drawers sliding open, the soft thud of boxes being pulled from shelves, the rustle of papers. What was she doing? Why had she left so suddenly? Part of him wanted to leave, to slip out before whatever this was became too complicated. But something held him there, an almost sacred weight in the air, a sense that this moment was bigger than him, bigger than the star, bigger than either of them. 10 minutes passed, though to Daniel it felt like an eternity, each second stretching into a lifetime of questions. He was just turning toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob, when the wooden door creaked open again. Rose emerged, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red, as if she'd been crying or fighting back tears. Her hands still trembled, but now she carried something. A small wooden box and a picture frame wrapped in yellowed linen. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step required courage. Setting the items on the counter, she looked at Daniel, her gaze steady but heavy with emotion. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of a truth she was only just beginning to speak. She placed the photograph face down on the counter, her fingers lingering on the frame as if reluctant to let it go. "Was your grandfather's full name Henry Cross?" Daniel nodded, his heart pounding now, though he didn't know why. "Yes, Henry Thomas Cross. Why?" Rose's hands moved slowly, almost reverently, as she turned the photograph around. The frame was weathered, its edges chipped and worn, but the black and white image inside was pristine, carefully preserved. It showed a young American soldier, no older than 20, his uniform crisp despite the chaos of war. His hand rested gently on the shoulder of a small girl, perhaps 10 years old, her hair tangled and her dress too large, hanging off her slight frame. She clutched a stuffed bear, one ear missing, its button eyes staring blankly into the distance. Behind them, the ruins of a building, perhaps a school or a church, stood jagged and broken, a testament to a world torn apart. But it was the soldier's smile that stopped Daniel in his tracks, that lopsided, humble grin, the same one he'd seen in the only photograph his family had of his grandfather from the war. The slight tilt of the head, the heavy gaze that was half solemn, half tender. It was unmistakable. "That's him," Daniel whispered, his voice catching in his throat. His eyes flicked to the girl in the photo, then back to Rose. "And that's you." Rose nodded, her movement slow, deliberate, as if speaking the truth aloud made it more real, more fragile. "I was born in a small village outside Caen in Normandy," she began, her voice soft but steady, carrying the cadence of someone revisiting a memory long buried. "My parents were resistance sympathizers. They risked everything, delivering messages to Allied troops, hiding radios in the cellar, passing food to soldiers moving through the woods at night." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the wooden box she'd brought from the back. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of fragments from another life. A child's ration book, a faded ribbon, a small brass key. Each item was a piece of her history, a tether to the girl in the photograph, to the war that had shaped her. In the dim light of the antique shop, Daniel stood clutching a worn photograph, a folded map with faint pencil markings, and a yellowed French identity document from 1944. The weight of these relics pressed against his chest, not just physically, but with a gravity that stirred something deep within him. He had walked into this shop expecting a simple exchange, trade a piece of his grandfather's paste for enough cash to keep him afloat another month. But now, as Rose Alcott's trembling voice filled the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of memory, loss, and unspoken promises. Rose's eyes, sharp yet softened by time, glistened as she recounted the summer of 1944. The Americans had rolled into their small French town that August, their tanks rumbling through the cobblestone streets, bringing with them a fleeting sense of salvation. "We thought the worst was behind us," she said, her voice catching like a thread snagged on a nail. The townsfolk had dared to hope, to breathe, to believe the shadow of war might finally lift. But hope, she learned, could be a fragile thing. The Germans came back, their boots stomping through the night like a storm that refused to relent. "They had lists," Rose continued, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter as if anchoring herself to the present. "My parents' names were on them." Daniel's breath hitched, his heart pounding as he imagined the terror of that moment. Rose had been just a child, left alone in a house that must have felt like a cage as the world outside descended into chaos. Her parents had been at a clandestine meeting in a nearby village, leaving her with a single American soldier, Private Cross. The name alone sent a shiver through Daniel. It was his grandfather's name, though he'd never heard this story, never known the man who carried that name as anything more than a quiet figure who smoked a pipe on the porch and spoke little of his past. Rose's gaze drifted, as if she could still see the flickering lamplight of that night. I remember his voice as she said, her words soft but heavy with reverence. So calm, so steady, like he wasn't afraid, even when I was. She described how Private Cross had heard the low growl of German trucks before she did, his instincts honed by a war that had already taken so much from him. Without hesitation, he'd pulled her from her bed, her small body trembling as he guided her to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "Don't move," he'd whispered, his voice a lifeline in the darkness. "No matter what you hear." Rose's hands shook as she recalled the moment, her knuckles whitening against the counter. She'd lain there, curled up in the cold, damp space, listening to the world above erupt into violence, shouts in a language she barely understood, the sharp crack of gunfire, the thud of boots too close to her hiding place. "He ran out the front," she said, her voice breaking. "He drew them away from the house, from me." Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity, as she lay frozen, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would betray her. She thought he was dead. The silence that followed the chaos was worse than the noise. It was the silence of absence, of loss. But then, at dawn, the Americans returned. They spoke of a soldier who'd led the Germans into an ambush, saving not just her, but the entire village. "He was wounded," Rose said, her eyes meeting Daniel's, "but alive." Daniel's throat tightened, his fingers curling around the photograph in his hand. The image was grainy, but he could make out the faint outline of a young man in uniform, his grandfather's face, stoic, unassuming, the kind of face that carried burdens without complaint. "He never told us," Daniel managed, his voice thick with emotion. Not a single word. His grandfather had returned from the war, built a life, raised a family, and never once spoke of this act of courage. To Daniel, he'd been a man of routine, of quiet evenings and practical advice, not a hero who'd risked everything for a stranger's child. Rose's lips curved into a sardine, knowing smile. "Men like him rarely do," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She reached across the counter, her hand resting lightly on his, her touch grounding him in the moment. "For 70 years, I've carried this debt in my heart. I didn't even know his full name, just Cross." She'd spent decades searching, chasing fragments of records, hoping to find the man who'd saved her life. But Private Cross had vanished from history, his story buried in the chaos of war's aftermath. "I made a promise," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of that vow. "If I ever found him or his family, I would repay what he did for me." Daniel tried to speak, but the words caught in his chest, tangled in the flood of emotions he hadn't expected to feel. He'd come here to pawn a piece of metal that had sat in a drawer for years, gathering dust alongside his grandfather's other relics. It was supposed to be a transaction, a means to an end. But now, as Rose's story unfolded, he realized this was no ordinary exchange. This was about legacy, about a moment in time that had shaped lives across generations. Rose carefully closed the wooden box that held the metal, its surface worn but gleaming with quiet dignity. She placed it beside the photograph, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a thick envelope, its edges yellowed with age but sealed with care. "For 20 years, she began, her voice steady now, "I've kept a separate account at the bank. It started small, just a little here and there when the shop did well, but I never touched it." Daniel stared at the envelope, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because when I was 10 years old, hiding under those floorboards, I made a promise," Rose said, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. "I told myself that if I ever found that soldier or his family, I would repay what can never be repaid." She pushed the envelope towards him, her movements deliberate. "This isn't about money, Daniel. It's about honoring a debt that's lived in my heart for 70 years. Daniel shook his head, his hands trembling as he pushed the envelope back toward her. "Miss Alcott, I can't take this. That was something he did, not me." His voice cracked, the weight of his grandfather's sacrifice pressing down on him. He'd spent his life feeling like he was failing to live up to the man his grandfather had been, scraping by, always one step from falling apart. How could he accept this when he'd done nothing to earn it? Rose's expression didn't falter. She leaned forward, her hand covering his with a warmth that felt like it could hold back the world. "You're wrong," she said softly. "Your grandfather didn't save me for gratitude. He didn't know I'd grow up, move to America, run a shop in a quiet little town, but he saved me anyway. And now you're here carrying his blood, his name, his legacy, about to pawn the very metal that proves he lived for something bigger than himself." She slid the envelope back toward him, her voice unwavering. "This isn't a gift, Daniel. It's not charity. It's a settlement of a debt I've carried my whole life." Daniel's eyes burned as he stared at the envelope, then at the metal gleaming on the counter. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence filled with the weight of everything he'd never known about the man who'd raised him. "He never told me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He never said he was a hero." Rose's smile was tinged with sorrow. "The real ones never do," she said. She stood, moving slowly to a small safe in the corner of the shop. The lock clicked open, and when she returned, she handed Daniel a cream-colored card. "Call this number tomorrow," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's a veterans organization, Veterans United. My late husband served on their board. They help people like you find the support you deserve." Daniel turned the card over in his hand, his mind reeling. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice raw with disbelief. Rose's expression softened, her eyes shimmering with the weight of 70 years of gratitude. "Because 70 years ago, a stranger risked everything for a little girl," she said. "And now I'm keeping my promise to him." The weight of the velvet pouch in Daniel's hands felt like more than just the metal it contained. It carried the gravity of a life he'd only begun to understand. As he sat across from Rose in the dimly lit pawn shop, the air thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten stories, he cradled the pouch as if it might slip away. The object inside, a relic from his grandfather's past, had once been just a curiosity, something tucked in a drawer, gathering dust alongside unpaid bills and faded memories. Now it was a lifeline tethering him to a man he'd loved but never truly known. His fingers traced the soft fabric, and in that moment, he felt the weight of not just his grandfather's courage, but his own unraveling life. The years since his discharge had been a blur of sleepless nights, bureaucratic dead ends, and a gnawing sense of drift. This pouch, this small, unassuming thing, was suddenly a bridge, stretching from the battle-scarred fields of France to this cluttered shop in a sleepy American town, from a war his grandfather had survived, to the quieter, lonelier war Daniel was fighting now. Rose watched him, her eyes sharp but kind, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by pain. She leaned forward, her hands steady on the counter, and handed him the pouch with a gentleness that belied its significance. "This belongs with you now," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "It's not just a reminder of who he was, but of who you are. Don't forget that." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Daniel's chest. He hadn't come here expecting to be seen, let alone understood. He'd walked into the shop with nothing but desperation, ready to trade a piece of his grandfather's legacy for a few bucks to keep the lights on. Now he felt exposed, as if Rose had glimpsed the hollow ache he'd been carrying for months, the one he hadn't dared name, even to himself. "I didn't expect this," Daniel admitted, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the shop's fluorescent lights. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, searching for something. An answer, maybe, or just permission to feel the weight of it all. "This morning I didn't even know who I was. Now it feels like I'm holding two lives in my hands. Mine and his." His throat tightened as he spoke, the words heavy with the realization that his grandfather's story wasn't just a memory, it was a responsibility, a legacy. He thought of the old man, quiet and unassuming, who'd never spoken of the war, never boasted of the lives he'd touched. That silence had always seemed like strength to Daniel, but now he wondered if it had been a burden too. Rose's expression softened, but her voice held steady. "No one ever expects the past to come knocking," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But when it does, it's usually trying to tell you something. Legacy isn't about glory or parades. It's about carrying the good forward. keeping it alive when the world tries to forget. Her words were a quiet command, and Daniel felt them settle into him, anchoring him to the moment. He exhaled, his thumb brushing the pouch's fabric again, as if he could feel his grandfather's presence in its weave. "The VA lost my paperwork," he said, the confession spilling out before he could stop it. 6 months of waiting, chasing, drowning. I didn't know how much more I could take. His voice cracked, and he looked down, ashamed of the vulnerability that had slipped through. Rose didn't flinch. "Then let this be where you turn it around," she said, her tone unwavering, but not unkind. She reached across the counter, tapping a business card she'd given him earlier. "Call them. Tell them Rose Alcott sent you. They'll answer." Her certainty was a lifeline, and Daniel's fingers closed around the card as he slipped it into his pocket. The small act feeling like a promise to himself. Rose wasn't done. She stepped behind the counter, pulling out a worn spiral notebook and flipping to a page where a name was written in neat, elegant cursive. "One more thing, Braham," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd made a habit of quiet action. "My nephew runs a security firm, works mostly with veterans, gives them purpose, structure. Bring your resume next week. I'll introduce you." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "You're serious?" he asked, the question tumbling out before he could temper it. Rose's gaze didn't waver. "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just the kind of steady, practical help Daniel had always associated with his grandfather. He stood, reaching across the counter to shake her hand, his grip firmer than he'd expected. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with gratitude he couldn't quite articulate. Rose's smile was warm, her handshake steady. "You don't have to pay anything. Just keep going." That's what he would have done. As Daniel turned toward the door, the pouch tucked close to his chest, he paused. On the counter, the photograph still lay. A young soldier, his grandfather, standing beside a little girl in the rubble of war-torn France. Their faces were frozen in time, unaware that their story was still unfolding, still shaping lives decades later. "I won't forget this," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Rose's eyes softened, a flicker of memory passing through them. "Neither did I," she said, "for 70 years. Stepping outside, Daniel squinted against the sunlight, brighter now that the rain had passed. The world felt different, not hopeful, not yet, but clearer, like a fog had lifted. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of direction, fragile but real. In a life that had offered him silence for too long, that was everything. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat in a folding chair at the Veterans Resource Center, the faint smell of coffee and old linoleum filling the air. A handful of older men shuffled in, their cups steaming, their eyes cautious but curious. Most came for the usual, job leads, housing referrals, or just a warm meal. But today was different. Daniel stood, his throat tight with nerves, and faced the small group. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "My name's Daniel Cross. I did 2 tours overseas. Came back thinking I was fine, but I was just quiet." A few of the men chuckled, a knowing sound that eased the tension in his chest. He held up the photograph, the one Rose had given him, his grandfather and a young girl standing amid the ashes of war. "This is my grandfather, Henry Cross," he said, his voice growing stronger. "He saved a child during World War II. Never told anyone. Kept it locked away with this." He pulled the silver star from his jacket pocket, still nestled in its velvet pouch, and held it up for the room to see. "I almost sold it to survive. But in doing that, I found a story I didn't know I carried." He paused, letting the silence settle, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on him. "That's why I'm here," he continued, "to share that story and maybe help you find yours." The room was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence he'd grown used to. It was something else, something like connection. The room hummed with a quiet energy, the kind that seeps into your soul when something profound is about to happen. Daniel stood at the front, hands loosely clasped, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the Veterans Resource Center. This wasn't therapy, he'd always made clear, nor was it a lecture to preach or prod. It was a space for something deeper, a chance to bring pieces of the past into the light, a metal polished by years of touch, a photograph worn at the edges, a letter whose words still burned with meaning. These were the relics of lives shaped by war, of hearts that had endured its weight. In the front row, an older man gripped his cane, his knuckles pale from the effort. His voice, rough but curious, broke the quiet. So what, like show and tell for soldiers? Daniel's smile was warm, his eyes bright with purpose. Exactly, he said, his voice steady but alive. But we're not kids trading baseball cards. We're here to remind each other of what we've survived, and maybe to discover what we still have to offer. He didn't expect a standing ovation, a nod here, a shrug there, a few wary glances. But as the hour unfolded, the room came alive. A Korean War veteran, hands trembling, pulled a telegram from his wallet. Its paper yellowed from decades of being carried close. He spoke of 1953, of a message that had anchored him when hope seemed lost, his voice breaking under the weight of memory. Then came the Vietnam medic, a woman whose eyes held a quiet reverence as she unwrapped a blood-stained field dressing. It wasn't a grim keepsake, but a sacred one, a tribute to the lives she'd fought to save and those she couldn't. Her fingers traced the stains, her voice steady as she recounted the case of those moments, the screams, the silence. She'd kept it not to dwell on loss, but to honor the lives that had touched hers. The room held its breath, every word a thread in their shared story. Daniel shared, too, holding up a letter, its paper fragile but heavy with meaning, found by his wife, Rose, behind an old photograph. His grandfather had written it to a French girl in the darkest days of war, words of hope that pierced the gloom. As Daniel read aloud, his voice softened, carrying the weight of his grandfather's faith, a faith that had reached him across time. It wasn't just a letter, it was a bridge between generations, a testament to enduring humanity. Over the next month, the sessions grew. What started as 5 veterans sharing fragments of their past became a community. Stories spread, drawing in new faces, new voices, laughter, long buried, surfaced in bursts, healing wounds left unspoken. Tears fell, not from shame but as a release, a way to shed burdens carried too long. A local paper ran a feature capturing the raw truth of the gatherings. The city council offered a grant, ensuring the program's survival. And every week Rose was there, front row, her presence a quiet anchor. Her eyes shone with pride, with understanding, as the room became a space for reclaiming lives. Daniel saw it clearly now. Legacy wasn't just what you were given, like a name or an heirloom. It was what you built, what you passed on, what you left to endure beyond your years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was creating something that would outlast him. The next month, Daniel arrived early at the center. The coffee pot hummed, filling the air with warmth. The chairs sat in their familiar circle, a silent promise of shared vulnerability. But today felt different. Maybe it was the sunlight spilling through the high windows, casting golden light across the room, or the quiet buzz among the volunteers. Or maybe it was the guest list. Daniel had invited someone new, Private Elena Ruiz. She'd come to the center the week before, her uniform crisp, her boots still shining from basic training. Young, quiet, she carried herself with a stillness that hinted at a search for meaning. Someone had told her to hear this guy Cross speak, and she'd come, listening with an intensity that caught Daniel's attention. He'd asked her to arrive early today. When she stepped inside, her eyes cautious but curious, Daniel handed her a folded envelope. "My grandfather wrote this 80 years ago," he said softly, "to a girl he didn't think would survive the night. Somehow she did, and somehow it found me." He paused, holding her gaze. "We're starting a letter initiative, Elena, one letter from each generation to the next." Her eyes widened, a flicker of awe and doubt. "You want me to write one?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded. "Not today, not to me, for the next you." Elena held the envelope to her chest, her fingers tightening as if it were a medal of courage. That afternoon, the session was electric. The room brimmed with people, not just veterans, but families, grandchildren, students from the local college, all drawn to listen, to understand. Rose sat in her usual spot, hands folded, her photograph beside her, a quiet reminder of her own journey. Daniel stepped back, letting Elena take the floor. Her knees shook at first, but her voice grew strong as she read a letter she'd written the night before. To the soldier who comes after me, she began, her words steady with purpose. I don't know your name or where you'll serve, but I know the weight you'll carry, and I want you to know you're not alone. The room fell silent, a sacred hush. Then one by one, others stood. An aging Marine spoke of a promise to a fallen friend, his voice thick with unfulfilled vows. A Gold Star mother held up a dog tag, its cold metal a link to a son lost too soon. She spoke of the day it arrived, the way her heart broke and rebuilt itself to carry his memory. And Rose stood, her voice soft but resolute, sharing how she'd pieced her life back together. Not just after the war, but through years of wrestling with guilt for surviving when others hadn't. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of pain, resilience, and hope. Daniel watched, his heart swelling, knowing this was more than a program. It was a legacy, carried in letters, in memories, in the courage to keep speaking the truth. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the pawn shop, and the weight of the silver star pinned to Daniel's chest felt heavier now. Not with burden, but with purpose. It wasn't just a medal anymore. It had transformed into a guiding light, a reminder of the courage that pulsed through his veins, inherited from a grandfather he'd never fully understood until now. Standing at the podium of the Veterans Resource Center, Daniel adjusted the crisp collar of his button-down shirt, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of the star. The room buzzed with the quiet anticipation of veteran students, community leaders, and families, all gathered for the center's annual recognition event. Rows of chairs stretched before him, filled with faces that carried their own unspoken stories, their own battles fought in silence. Behind him, a cork bulletin board stood proudly, its surface crowded with envelopes, each one a handwritten testament to lives touched, promises kept, and courage passed forward. Above it, a simple sign read, "Letters Forward," its letters bold and unapologetic, as if daring the world to forget. Daniel's eyes drifted to the front row, where Rose sat, her posture still graceful despite the years. She clutched a faded photograph, its edges worn from decades of careful handling. A young soldier and a little girl, frozen in a moment of wartime kindness. Her face, lined with the wisdom of survival, held a quiet strength that made Daniel's throat tighten. He cleared it softly and began to speak, his voice steady but laced with emotion. 6 months ago, I walked into a pawn shop, ready to let go of the last piece of myself that still meant something. He paused, letting the weight of that moment settle over the room. I thought I was just trying to survive, to scrape by in a world that felt like it had no place for me. But that day, I met someone who showed me that a legacy isn't something you are handed, it's something you choose to live up to every single day. His gaze flicked back to Rose, and he saw her nod slightly, her eyes glistening with memories she'd carried for decades. In that pawn shop, she'd recognized the medal he'd been ready to surrender, not just as a trinket, but as a symbol of a debt she'd vowed to repay. She'd been that little girl in the photograph, saved by a soldier's courage when bombs tore through her world. For years, she'd held on to that memory, not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve, waiting for the moment she could return the kindness. Daniel's grandfather, Henry Cross, had never spoken of his heroism, not to his family, not to anyone. Yet his silent act of bravery had woven a thread through time, connecting a frightened child to a struggling grandson in a way neither could have foreseen. Daniel's hand rested over the silver star, its edges pressing into his palm. My grandfather never told me his story, he continued, his voice softening. He didn't need to. It found me anyway, through the hands of someone who never forgot what he did. Through Rose. He gestured toward her, and the room turned to look, a ripple of respect passing through the crowd. She carried his courage in her heart, not just as a memory, but as a call to action. And now, because of her, I'm learning to carry it too. The Heritage of Courage program, born from that chance encounter, had grown into something extraordinary. What began as a single act of remembrance had blossomed into a movement. Twice a week, veterans, families, and even strangers gathered at the center, filling the bulletin board with envelopes. Each one held a story, a piece of someone's soul written for the next one who needs this. The letters were lifelines, bridging generations, wars, and wounds. Some were penned by grizzled veterans who'd seen too much, their words raw and unpolished. Others came from children of soldiers, piecing together their parents' sacrifices through faded letters and half-told tales. And some were from people who'd simply been moved by the program, strangers who felt the pull of a legacy larger than themselves. Each envelope was a quiet rebellion against forgetting, a promise that no one's sacrifice would fade into the noise of the world. As Daniel spoke, he felt the weight of every story in the room. He thought of his grandfather, a man who'd never sought glory, who'd tucked his medal away in a drawer and carried on with life. Henry Cross had been a quiet giant, the kind of hero who didn't need a spotlight to shine. Daniel's chest ached with pride and regret. Pride for the man he came from, regret for the years he'd spent not knowing. He'd spent so long running from his own struggles, believing he was alone in his fight to find meaning. But standing here in front of this crowd, with Rose's steady gaze anchoring him, he realized he'd never been alone. His grandfather's courage had been there all along, waiting for him to claim it. After the speech, the reception hall hummed with conversation. People milled about, sharing stories over coffee and paper plates piled with sandwiches. The bulletin board stood in the corner, a beacon drawing curious glances and reverent touches. Someone approached Daniel, a community leader with a clipboard and a warm smile. "What's next for you, Daniel?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious. He didn't hesitate. "Keep showing up," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Keep listening. Keep passing it forward." It wasn't a grand plan, but it was honest. It was enough. Later that night, as Daniel drove Rose home through the quiet streets, she sat beside him, her hands cradling a small wooden box. It was the same box she'd kept sealed for decades, a treasure chest of her past. Wartime papers, ration cards, and a single letter from a soldier to a 10-year-old girl. The letter was simple, written in the hurried scrawl of a man who didn't know if he'd survive the next day. But it had changed Rose's life. It had told her to be brave, to keep going, to never forget that she was worth saving. She'd carried those words through years of hardship, through loss and rebuilding, until the day she saw that medal in the pawn shop and knew it was time to pass them on. At her doorstep, Rose turned to Daniel, her eyes bright despite the late hour. "You know," she said, her voice soft but steady, "for years I thought that medal was the end of the story. I thought it was all I had left of him." She paused, her smile bittersweet. But it wasn't. It was just the beginning. Daniel looked down at the silver star pinned to his chest, its faint gleam catching the porch light. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, like the first deep breath after a long dive. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just the beginning." As he stepped back into the cool night air, Daniel felt the weight of the moment linger. Not all stories end with parades or monuments. Some unfold in quiet living rooms, in handwritten letters slipped into envelopes, in small acts of remembrance that ripple through time. Heroes aren't always forged in the spotlight. They're shaped in the shadows, in the sacrifices no one sees, in the hands of those who choose to carry their stories forward. Henry Cross had never asked to be remembered, but his courage lived on, in the woman he'd saved, in the grandson who'd almost lost his way, and in the letters that now lined a bulletin board, each one a testament to the enduring power of quiet bravery. In a world that moves too fast, where stories of sacrifice are often drowned out by the clamor of the present, Daniel had learned something profound. Legacy isn't about fame or recognition. It's about the values you live by when no one's watching, the choices you make when the world feels heavy. It's about the person sitting next to you at a diner who once saved a village, or the man fixing your fence who stood between a child and a bullet. It's about showing up, listening, and reminding others that their stories matter. And as Daniel drove home under a sky scattered with stars, he knew he'd spend the rest of his life doing just that, carrying the courage forward, one letter, one story, one quiet act at a time.